Hello and welcome to the special episode of National Security Conversations. Yesterday, on the 14th of February, 42 CRPF soldiers were killed in a terror attack in Pulwama in Kashmir. The Pakistan-based terror organization Jaish-e-Mohammed has claimed responsibility for this attack. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that those behind the attack have made a huge mistake. India has already withdrawn the most favored nation status given to Pakistan. So the questions that we are asking are, was there an intelligence failure? Was it the handiwork of Pakistan? How will the Modi government respond to this? What implications would that have? To discuss this and more, I have with me in the studio Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, the founding editor of The Wire, and a senior journalist, Mr. Ajai Shukla, defense editor of the Business Standard, and Moeed Yusuf of the US Institute of Peace, joining me from Islamabad. Welcome to the NSC, gentlemen. Ajay, let me begin with you. What do you make of the attack that took place yesterday?
Well, one thing that already seems absolutely clear is that it was a major intelligence failure. An attack of this nature doesn't take place or get put together in a day or two. It would have required at least 3 weeks of intensive preparation, of getting the explosives together, of rigging the car up as an explosives device, of rehearsals, of reconnaissance of the area where they were going to strike. There would have been a lot of communication chatter associated with the strike. So, all in all, the Jammu and Kashmir police would have had a 3-week window to detect this strike, to figure it out, and to take action. And I have to say that they are very good at this job now. Over the years, they have accumulated such a degree of expertise, technical expertise, physical expertise, contacts on the ground, that when you have an attack, 9 times out of 10, the police turn up at the door of the guy a day or two before he launches the attack. But an attack like this could still slip through. So the biggest degree of soul searching that will take place around this attack is how could the intelligence have failed to such an extent that it failed to detect such a major attack.
What about the standard operating procedures from the CRPF side? You have over 70 trucks going in a convoy in a terror-infested region. Are they not sitting ducks? Haven't they thought about it?
No, I think that this 78 trucks thing is overstated a bit. Even if there were only 4 trucks and the attack took place in the same way, remember, out of these 78, only two vehicles came into the attack zone.
Multiple cars laden with explosives.
You see, the attack we are talking about was a 1-car attack.
That's right.
And in that, even a regular convoy, this convoy was, let's say, 3 times the normal size. Even a regular convoy of 25 vehicles provides sufficient targets. So I think that this in itself is not a major factor in the attack. What is a major factor in the attack is the fact that these vehicles move in a relatively unprotected way. And the larger intelligence picture that should have detected an attack of this nature. You see, an ROP, for example, road opening patrol that prepares the ground every day for a convoy to move, could not have detected something like this, because ROPs detect ground-based IEDs. But a car-based IED, which is a dynamic mobile thing, can still slip through. That can only be detected, or an attack of that nature is forestalled by good intelligence. And that is where the failure lies.
Siddharth, do you think this is a wake-up call to rejig our Kashmir policy, as it were? I mean, if you look at the data from 2013 onwards, violence has spiked in Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, the local boys joining militancy in the year 2013, it was just 6. Last year in 2018, it crossed 200. So is it a wake-up call for the government of India and for India in general?
I think there are several dimensions to India's Kashmir policy, right? Government of India's Kashmir policy. There is a military dimension, or shall we say an internal security dimension, which is that how to deal militarily with armed attacks, or the threat of armed attacks, right? Which requires a combination of confronting situations when they arise, but also preempting them through intelligence, right? The second aspect is the political dimension, which is ensuring that conditions in the valley are not conducive to the population at large either providing recruits or tacit or overt support for militants, right? So there's the political dimension. And then there is the external dimension, which is how you deal with the challenge that is obviously posed by Pakistan's interference in J&K, which takes multiple forms, but the most deadly of which is obviously supporting Pakistan-based terrorist organizations. So, on all these three counts, I feel that the government needs to rethink its strategy. The external dimension, we have, the Modi government itself has swerved between engagement without much preparation to abandoning any form of engagement without much forethought as to how you will pick up the threads later. So there's been no consistency in the government of India's Pakistan policy. I would say not just under Modi, even going back to Manmohan Singh. I would say overly military dimension. Like, for the last year and a half, 2 years, everybody from the governor down has been celebrating what they call the lifespan. I think the governor himself said that the lifespan of these militants is very short. And, this is no grounds for, you need to address why young people are joining. And also ask yourself whether taking out these people, whether over a 2-week or 3-week career or a longer period, is actually serving the military goal of ending militancy, or is it unleashing a different kind of dynamic?
Just to reinforce what you're saying, every funeral is a recruiting rally.
So I think that we need to understand this dynamic, and I think that this the celebrating of the taking down of these younger recruits in a very short period of time, in a narrow way you can say yes, it's a security success, but in the medium to long term, it doesn't actually help, or it has not helped, because in one attack of this kind, a local militant has exacted terrible death toll on the CRPF. So I think this dimension also needs to be addressed. And then the final is the political dimension. There's been absolutely no forward movement on that. And the question that needs to be asked is that, what is it which motivated like this? I'm not a great one for looking at root causes of terror, quite frankly. But so if it comes to Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Taiba, I'm not bothered. I don't think the government of India should lose sleep over what animates or motivates an elite terrorist or somebody from POK side to come into India and wreak havoc, right? You have to just deal with the threat that they pose. But when young Indian lads are joining, right, and in this case a young lad from Pulwama who lived hardly 20 kilometers away from the strike zone, the numbers have been going up. So we need to ask ourselves, what is it that motivates a young person like this? And very often they are relatively well off, relatively well educated. Why do they feel the degree of alienation they do, that they see themselves willing to sacrifice their life and exact a terrible toll on young jawans of the CRPF or the army? What is it that motivates them? I think we need to understand that, we need to deal with that. And so far I've seen no initiative going back for the last 3-4 years, even though the Modi government's alliance with the PDP, when it was formed in 2015, carried the promise of some kind of engagement, but that hasn't been followed through.
Ajay, do you see it that way? Is it the failure of a political imagination in New Delhi that has caused this terrible violence in Jammu and Kashmir? If you look at, say, from 2004 onwards, up until 2011 or so, the violence came down, and then, of course, it started picking up again. What do you attribute this to? Is it Pakistan? Is it a local indigenous support for something, or is it our own failure in Kashmir?
Well, the root causes of the Kashmir problem are well known and go back all the way to 1947. But given that context, India had somehow over the years managed to still handle the Kashmir problem until the start of insurgency in 1989. Since then, we've had several phases, ups and downs. And the most recent sort of phase of up and down was the 2008 to 2010 phase, when for various reasons half of Kashmir was out on the streets and pelting stones at the security forces and taking huge casualties.
But the militants did not play much of a role during those phases.
A secondary role, and that was when the worry should have started, that what is it that is bringing out the common Kashmiri, not the militant, onto the streets. But after that, even so, from 2010 to about 2014-15, we had reached a stage of relative calm, relative stability. The Manmohan Singh government had a certain sort of economic growth impetus to it. Things were going fine in Kashmir. there was not a lot of pressure on Islamic groups and so on. The resentment that you now see in Kashmir was not there at that stage, and violence had dropped to almost nil. Starting from the killing of Burhan Wani in 2016, we've reached a stage of real resurgence of terrorism where you not just have militancy on the rise, but you also have the people coming out onto the streets in support of militancy. And this is motivated by that high degree of alienation that Siddharth was referring to just now, which the government has done nothing to contain. The government has taken kinetic steps to combat militants. The number of militants being killed has risen year on year. So have incidentally the number of security forces, but the militants have taken a heavier toll. But the driving force, the root force, the causes of militancy and alienation have not been addressed. And as Siddharth said, to echo what he said, when well-off, well-educated people who have everything to live for,
Not from madrasas.
not from madrasas, not at all. These are guys who you and I would sort of perhaps be working with in an office environment. When they start going out there and blowing themselves up and picking up the gun, knowing that their projected lifespan is 6 months, then you really need to start worrying.
Siddharth, the J&K Governor Satyapal Malik said the other day that, in fact, blamed the PDP, Member Mufti, of fomenting disaffection by spreading what he calls soft separatism for political traction in the valley. This is interesting because until a few months ago, the Kashmiris were complaining about the coalition government between PDP and BJP. But how do you sort of assess the impact of this coalition government on what we are seeing today?
Look, the governor's allegation, I mean, he holds a high constitutional position, so one should be gentle in one's criticism. But I think what he said has absolutely no basis. The fact is that the PDP, if anything, is playing catch up with public sentiment. Public sentiment, don't forget that PDP functioned in a way, and this is the irony of it, it functioned as a safety valve for the Indian state because it was the one party that was not tainted by association with 40, 50 years of what Kashmiris call sellout politics and so on and so forth. So it wasn't NC, it wasn't Congress. They were articulating, particularly in the heyday when Mufti Sahab really rose to prominence by opposing the task force and the SOG and speaking of human rights violations. So the PDP carved out a space for itself within electoral politics. And what today is reviled as soft separatism, I would say served a very useful purpose for the Indian state and the Indian system because it helped the political process to absorb a certain kind of sentiment for which there was no room earlier. And it was drawing people into engagement with the political process. That was the role of the PDP. So when the PDP struck an alliance with the BJP, many people were skeptical. Many people wished that the PDP should have signed up with the NC. That would have had a separate dynamic because of the Jammu versus Kashmir politics. But the agenda for alliance document that the BJP and PDP negotiated together contained the seeds of a statesman-like approach towards resolving the J&K issue in both its external and internal dimensions. And it's a pity that this was never followed through. Mufti Saab referred to it, Mehbooba spoke about it, but the BJP was least interested in it, as it seems with hindsight. So I think that attacks on the PDP, this is a convenient alibi for the governor or for our kind of internet or social media or television studio warriors who are flailing to find a villain or somebody to blame other than the lack of any kind of proper official policy. So it's an easy target to say, well, PDP or NC or these people are responsible. But the fact is that public sentiment today is way ahead of where these two parties stand. These parties are trying to present themselves as being relevant as electoral forces in a situation where the public faith in elections and public faith in the political process in the valley is probably at an all-time low.
Ajay, a different question. While acknowledging the indigenous angle to what happened yesterday, how much do you think it is a handiwork of the Pakistani deep state about money, weapons, influence, whatever? How do you sort of assess the influence of Pakistan in what is happening in Kashmir today?
Well, Pakistan's support to what is happening in Kashmir is undeniable and unquestionable and well documented. And it is very hard to argue against that. But it is equally hard to argue against the indigenous wellsprings of alienation and the drivers that they constitute for the militancy as it exists today. The Jaish-e-Mohammed presents a particularly difficult sort of case in this entire thing. On the one hand, it's a well-acknowledged Pakistani group. It's a group that has had a mixed relationship with the deep state in Pakistan. You remember that the two terrorist attacks on Musharraf's life in 2003 were both by the Jaish-e-Mohammed. Even after that, they've had a very antagonistic relationship with the Pakistani deep state, not like the Lashkar-e-Toiba, which is an obedient lapdog of the state. But the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as it's constituted in Kashmir, is more aligned with the freedom struggle in Kashmir, as it were, as they call it, rather than the Pakistani agenda in Kashmir. It is not like they're taking orders from Masood Azhar on a daily basis about what they are going to do. And in this, the Jaish-e-Mohammed has been particularly troublesome for Pakistan. You remember that parliamentary attack in 2001 almost brought the two countries to war. Similarly, the several suicide attacks in Kashmir have taken place, traced back to the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which have caused trouble. Now, this particular attack, Uri and Pathankot, were Jaish-e-Mohammed attacks. Now, this particular attack, which will have deep consequences for Pakistan, is also caused by the Jaish-e-Mohammed. So, for the Pakistanis, the Jaish-e-Mohammed has been a particularly troublesome group.
Do you then say that India should take cue from that and then try and have a word with the Pakistanis and say take care of?
They're already doing that. They've issued a statement saying we want to see verifiable action by Pakistan against the Jaish-e-Mohammed.
That may be a way out of this.
That could be a way out if Pakistan takes verifiable action and shuts down the Jaish and takes Azhar Masood into custody. You'll find the issue being resolved without military retaliation.
Moeed, explain this to me. In the recent past, the Pakistani leaders, Imran Khan, and even the Pakistani army chief, General Bajwa, have been talking about the need to have peace with India. And now you have a Pakistan-based terrorist organization, Jaish-e-Mohammed, carrying out this dastardly attack in Pulwama, in Kashmir, killing more than 40 Indian soldiers. How do you explain this sort of seeming contradiction? On the one hand, you talk peace. On the other hand, you have these kind of attacks carried out against India.
Well, look, this one is a real puzzle, quite frankly. I simply cannot piece this together. Here is a situation where you've got a Pakistan that's been vocally saying that it wants to open up with India, have a conversation, and the Pakistani army chief is on record. Now, the Indian view, of course, I understand always is, well, the army is not on board and that's why things happen. This time, it's absolutely clear, and I can tell you with some confidence, that there's a real push from the top of the army to see if things could change and move in the positive direction. So in that moment for something like this to happen, knowing that Prime Minister Modi is in an election cycle, that he will use it domestically, the Saudi Crown Prince is coming tomorrow. Remember, this is Jaish-e-Mohammed who actually splintered and turned against the Pakistani state. So this one is a very, very complicated one, and it tells me quite frankly that Jaish is one organization that has not only survived, but it spread its tentacles in a way that perhaps it even can operate from places that it couldn't before, and Indian Kashmir being one of them from within.
Moeed, the Pulwama attack has come as a major shock for Indians here, and we are looking at the reactions from Pakistan. And I've been following Mr. Imran Khan's Twitter feed. He's been tweeting about all kinds of things, but there is hardly anything on his Twitter handle about the Pulwama attack. He's been completely quiet about it. How do you explain that?
Well, there hasn't been much. I mean, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a fairly generic diplomatic statement, of course, denying and pointing a finger at India, saying that Pakistan should not be blamed without any investigation or evidence. But other than that, there's been no response. And I think the Pakistani stance, quite frankly, on this, as far as I can tell, is don't provoke. Because the more you speak, you get into a mudslinging match, and perhaps the feeling is this would then become an international issue and India would cash into it. So I actually don't expect any response beyond what we've seen, unless there's an escalation of rhetoric from the Indian side.
Moeed, there are reports about Imran Khan's past dealings with Jaish-e-Mohammed. In fact, the reports suggest that Jaish-e-Mohammed even supported his candidature for the prime ministership of Pakistan. And given the fact that he has not yet responded officially to the Pulwama attack, which has killed over 40 Indian soldiers, how should we sort of put the two together and read the whole situation? Is he really hand in glove with the Jaish-e-Mohammed?
And that one before, that's the first. Who came up with that? Come on now, give the guy a break. He's had a good life, enjoyed the good things in life throughout. I wouldn't put him in that category. You know, he's got his views, and he was very much talking about the negotiation with the Taliban and all of that, and I get that. But this is odd. This is crazy. Him not having condemned it, I think the Pakistani state actually formally came out with a statement. I think he should absolutely condemn it if it hasn't happened. But I don't think you're going to see an over-the-top response from Pakistan. As I said earlier, I think the feeling here is that this may be internationalized by India if they make too much noise about it. But condemning it, absolutely, everybody should condemn it. No human being can see what has happened and look the other way. Good relationship or bad relationship, I mean, how can you not condemn? So I'm not sure, that there's anything to read into that. But this Jaish connection, this is a first for me.
Moeed, in an interview to BBC Urdu, Punjab Law Minister Rana Sanaullah was asked why legal action has never been taken against anti-India groups which were close to the Pakistani establishment. The minister ruled out the possibility of any legal action against the group, saying, "How can you prosecute a group with whom the state itself has been involved with?" What is your reaction to that?
Well, you picked a fairly controversial character to quote. Look, I think it's every state's responsibility ultimately to ensure that their territory is not misused, and if there are legal cases that can be concluded legally through the mechanism of the law, they absolutely should. So I'm not here, to defend something that's not that shouldn't be defended. I mean, the point is, if there are legal lacunas, they need to be fixed. But even diplomatically, my argument for the longest period has been, in fact, the India-Pakistan war is really in the diplomatic realm, and where India has been clearly winning since the Mumbai attacks is that. And so if there's legal proceedings that can solve issues and get us to move forward, if there are legal issues that Pakistan can benefit from, I'm all for them. As for his statement, how can you prosecute? Well, Pakistan has prosecuted a number of organizations and people, and I think India is quite frankly a bit unfair or self-serving in this argument that Pakistan never does anything, hasn't done anything. There's definitely a terrorist challenge that Pakistan is dealing with and has dealt with, but at the end of the day, this is not going to be fixed overnight. The problem is there, work is being done, but I think it's going to take a while before we can see the other end of this.
So, Siddharth, what are the political implications of the Pulwama attack and after for Mr. Modi's on political future? We are not too far away from the national elections, a crucial election for Mr. Modi. So what are the implications for him?
Well, I don't want to speculate, beyond a point, but clearly the approach, the government has defined its approach towards J&K and Pakistan as being one that is muscular, as one, and we've seen the celebration of the surgical strikes after Uri, once again being reprised in the form of a film whose slogan the Prime Minister and various ministers have been echoing in public events. Against that backdrop, it becomes very difficult politically for Mr. Modi, whatever his own inclinations may or may not be, to not be pushed in the direction of some form of retaliatory action. This much is very clear. And I think that's what makes for a very dangerous situation, because the contours of what may unfold as a consequence of retaliation are quite unpredictable. You will recall that after the first surgical strike, well, I shouldn't say first. I mean, there've been incidents and retaliatory action in the past, but the first acknowledged surgical strike by the government of India after Uri, the Pakistanis managed to avoid getting onto an escalatory ladder by simply denying that anything had happened, and perhaps India also chose its targets in a calibrated fashion to make it easy for Pakistan to, in a way, deny that anything had happened, so that there was no possibility of escalation. My sense is that any retaliatory action, if Modi feels compelled to go down that path politically and even in terms of diplomatically, if Pakistan doesn't do what Ajay is saying in terms of cracking down on the Jaish-e-Mohammed, so if Mr. Modi feels compelled to go down that path, I would imagine that politically the scale of whatever is done would probably be larger than what happened after Uri, and consequently, it would be difficult for Pakistan to once again say nothing happened. So there would be, and don't forget that the dynamic within Pakistan after the election of Imran Khan and some of the signaling that's coming out from the Pakistani military, slightly more aggressive language on J&K, and the altered dynamic in Afghanistan, which to my mind represents a certain strengthening of Pakistan's hand on the western side. That may well lead to a situation where the Pakistani military feels it inevitable that they would have to retaliate to any Indian retaliatory action. Right. And since we are in election season, the Indian side would have to retaliate to that retaliation. Right? So I'm saying we are in a kind of unpredictable dynamic. The fact is that the opposition, which probably has views on Mr. Modi's handling of J&K and Pakistan, will probably factor in the political cost to being overtly critical and will likely be silent. So I would say that there is domestic space for Mr. Modi to pretty much to respond in any way he wants. And so that is, so in a way the menu of options is wide open. It's a different matter as to whether there are options that he can take which will produce the kind of outcome that the public wants, which is an end to the violence. Right? Don't forget that if there is one, I mean, Pulwama is an advertisement for the fact that surgical strikes did not produce the outcome you wanted, right? So the answer should either be that, okay, fine, maybe surgical strikes are not the answer, and I need to look elsewhere, or more likely people will say, well, the surgical strike needs to be I need to double down on that strategy, right, and hit harder, hit more frequently. Don't forget that after the Uri surgical strike, the Nagrota attack came, which in many ways was actually militarily more deadly than Uri, because you're hitting the 16 Corps headquarters. Surgical strike did not follow then. So there's ample indication that the surgical strike, the utility of the surgical strike as a means of punishing Pakistan or as a means of deterring terrorist attacks doesn't work. So that, I hope, is an issue which will be factored in by the Government of India and by its military planners, and that they look at a full range of options if indeed they feel that they need to do.
The danger, of course, in that is that you behave like a person who goes to a foreign country and says something in a different language and the person doesn't understand it. So you just say the same thing a little louder. He's still not going to understand it.
Kinetic options cannot be ruled out. So if supposing the Modi government has to make up its mind to go for kinetic options, what are the options that it has? Because the MFN status clearly doesn't hurt Pakistan. Under $2 billion, what are we talking? So what kinetic options does the government of India have at this point of time?
Use of kinetic options, let me say, is now near inevitable. Because having established a benchmark with Uri, if the government does not do anything at this stage, and it does not retaliate against Pakistan's lack of action against the Jaish-e-Mohammed, everybody will say Modi learnt his lesson from the kinetic attacks and has stopped his big talk.
Are you suggesting that India should carry out the kinetic?
I am not suggesting that at all. I think it would be a terrible idea to have kinetic attacks. But I am saying the political dynamics that Modi has imposed on himself leaves him at this point with no choice but to carry out kinetic attacks. Now the question comes, what are those kinetic options? You obviously cannot do the same thing as you did last time. Firstly, because Pakistan will be well prepared for it, they will be expecting it. And secondly, last time was a near miracle that they could carry out those attacks, come back without a single casualty, without leaving a single Indian soldier on the Pakistani side. If you carry out the same attack and have a less successful outcome, everybody will say that, look, here's an Indian soldier, it will be on Pakistani television, they'll do what they did with Kulbhushan Yadav. It will be a disaster. To me, The only option that seems a viable option at this time is weapon strikes on Pakistani positions deeper inside the Pakistani line of control.
Fire assaults, you mean?
Maybe fire assaults using missiles, fire assaults using unmanned aerial vehicles, fire assaults using weapon systems like the BrahMos missile. Everybody's talking about airstrikes, but airstrikes is a manned method of going in. And again, you're sending a manned pilot into harm's way.
That escalates the...
With not just escalate, but with the risk that he might be captured and paraded and so on, made into a spectacle. So I would say that, out of all the options that occur to me, this seems to me the one that would be the most attractive to the military planners at this point in time.
Moeed, remember, these are two nuclear-powered nations. What would happen if India uses some kinetic options in response to the Pulwama attack? You know what happened after the Uri attack. The government of India carried out what it called surgical strikes against Pakistan. So do you think this is going to be something that Pakistan is keenly watching at this point of time? Also, you wrote a book just last year talking about crisis escalation between India and Pakistan and how the crisis between the two sides can be de-escalated. What are some of your thoughts at this point of time when things are really heating up between India and Pakistan?
I can't even bear to begin thinking about it. We are two nuclear powers here. This cannot end up well. You have to be honest, there isn't a military solution here. I completely understand this is very frustrating for India. It's been frustrating for a while, but this is exactly how it's going to stay. That's what nuclear weapons do. They prevent major war. Now, you want to talk about a surgical strike. I know where this goes. You've studied this more than anybody. What was it? It was essentially a campaign in public relations and signaling for domestic audience. What did it get anybody? What changed? I think the only answer here is to figure out how to prevent crises, and yes, absolutely, to not let terrorism derail any conversation, any positive movement between the two sides, but to think military is essentially to invite the US and others to come in and tell us to back off and cool down. And that's exactly what nuclear powers should hate, and India and Pakistan do hate. So, I mean, I'm not sure we want to even think about this, quite frankly. As you know, I published a book last year on this very subject of India-Pakistan crises and how to manage them better. So, based on that, three things come to mind immediately. First, we need to talk. India-Pakistan need to talk immediately through dependable, authoritative channels and figure out how not to let this become a crisis. That means both sides have to share as much information as they can, whatever they have, to be transparent in ensuring that they know what happened, how did it happen, who did it, and to absolve this idea that the other is trying to sabotage or one is trying to sabotage the other. I think conversation leading to transparency, immediately some real-time information to clear the air. And third, whether we like it or not, the US is going to be involved. Others are probably making phone calls already. I'd be surprised if Washington hasn't already made phone calls to Islamabad and Delhi. No point ignoring them. The world is not going to let this just continue when there's a nuclear environment. I think we should use the third party essentially to make sure there's de-escalation, and then of course figure out, not stop there. The mistake in the past has been we get into a crisis, we are told to de-escalate, we de-escalate, and that's the end of it. We now need to find a sustainable way not to allow something like this to happen again, and to have robust enough bilateral escalation control regimes that we don't have to go to the world or get the world to come and do our bidding for us.
The larger geopolitics of it, with what is happening in Afghanistan, with the American sort of withdrawal, impending withdrawal, with Taliban back to where it wanted to be, and Pakistan feeling triumphalistic about what is happening in Afghanistan, China close to Pakistan, Russians are cozying up, the Trump administration is uneasy, unsure of what its South Asia policy is. So how is it going to play out for Pakistan at this point of time, even if India tries to isolate Pakistan internationally?
So I'd like to answer that in the context of Ajay's reply to kinetic options, because it seems to me that if the government of India chooses options other than what they did after Uri, right, in other words, and these are obviously more visible options, right? They're not options that Pakistan can deny, right? Then the retaliation / escalation is inevitable, right? And that brings me to answer your question, which is that the geopolitical context becomes important. Now, here we need to understand that what is the backstory to Pulwama. If this is an operation that people in the Pakistani establishment were in the know of, however vaguely, they could easily predict and spell out how this was going to go down, because you cannot strike in this manner 6 weeks before an election and expect Modi not to do anything. Right? He will do something. He will feel compelled to do something, and then you will have to act. So, is the playbook that the Pakistani, if indeed the Pakistani establishment is involved or in the know, is the playbook that they're looking at one in which you will heighten international concern over, a very volatile situation along the line of control, based on strikes and counter strikes, and thus further the goal of what the Pakistani state has been pursuing diplomatically, which is to so-called internationalize the Kashmir situation. That's question number one, right? If, however, the Pakistanis themselves have been caught a bit off guard by what has happened, and maybe it is the case that by and large this was, if we don't know, quite frankly, what Jaish, what's the level of involvement of who in this, and I would hope that the government of India also factors in into any response credible intelligence on who the authors might be and what the level of knowledge and culpability of different players in the run-up to this incident were. That's important. But let's assume that the Jaish went and did this, and that the Pakistani deep state isn't particularly thrilled by it, because they realize this is going to complicate the situation. Then they may look for options that will help to tamp down, maybe recognizing the inevitability of some kind of Indian strike. They choose something which doesn't escalate. So a lot will depend on how the Pakistani establishment plays. But I would say that the geopolitical environment today, in a way, favors Pakistan, because the Trump administration, insofar as it even has a coherent foreign policy, which I doubt, is so consumed by domestic issues right now that I'm not sure how much of mind space the US establishment is going to devote to taking forward India's very legitimate concerns about Pakistani support for these kinds of groups. Chinese refusal to allow Masood Azhar to be put onto the 1267 list. So the Chinese are going to be looking at this very carefully. The Russian side, as you note, has warmed up to Islamabad over the last 3-4 years. So I would say the Pakistanis are likely to feel that they have some room for maneuver diplomatically. But I would say the game that they would play is to heighten international concern and alarm over the possibility of a flare-up along the LOC, and somehow to reignite, the demand for Kashmir issue to be discussed at various international fora.
Moeed, in an election rally in Jhansi, India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that Pakistan is going around the world with a begging bowl and that it is already internationally isolated. Do you think terrorism emanating from Pakistan has somehow isolated the Pakistani state in the eyes of the international community?
We are champions at believing on our own rhetoric, and I am not only talking about India. This entire region is like that. Look, this is not a Pakistani speaking. As an analyst, show me the data point that's telling you that Pakistan is isolated. I actually think Pakistan is probably more in the global scene today than it has been at any time since 9/11. Look at the US-Pakistan relationship on Afghanistan. Every day they're working together. Look at the Saudi Crown Prince coming to Pakistan and doing the kind of investment he's doing. Look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Pakistan's actually balanced Saudi Arabia with Doha, which is impossible right now given their relationship. So, I honestly think this is a great opportunity for India and Pakistan to move forward, precisely because both sides should be feeling secure about their global standing. India, for the reasons that the Indo-Pacific, US, a real player in that space, and Pakistan because actually after years of conflict in Afghanistan, which has destabilized Pakistan, its flanks are fairly covered. So we should come together as two secure nations trying to find a way forward, rather than sitting there and worrying about who's more isolated and how we can undercut the other. And quite frankly, as I said, this is a problem that exists across the region. That is why we are the least integrated region in the world. That is why we are behind sub-Saharan Africa in integration. That is why 1.5 billion Indians and Pakistanis are still struggling, and overwhelming majority are below the poverty line. We've got to move on.
Here is an unpopular question. Should now India talk to Pakistan, or should India say that no more dialogue with Pakistan on any of these?
Well, see, that there's a practical issue coming up, which is that the Kartarpur talks are already scheduled, and I think it would be a shame to call them off. I've always maintained that India has operated under some kind of a misgiving or some kind of misunderstanding about the role that dialogue plays as part of a counter-terrorism strategy. We've seen ample evidence of the fact that not talking does not serve as a lever of influence over Pakistan. It does not disincentivize Pakistani support for terror groups. Rather, the period when India and Pakistan were engaged, the Musharraf-Manmohan talks, for example, or when Vajpayee began the whole process, that is when actually terror groups and their attacks began to subside. So I would say that we shouldn't use dialogue not to talk or not to talk as a means of exerting pressure, because it doesn't work. So insofar as you perceive a military/security threat, you need military/security/intelligence tools to deal with that. But somehow we've boxed ourselves into a situation where withdrawing the offer of dialogue is seen as a great step that we can take, which will hurt Pakistan. It doesn't hurt Pakistan, and to my mind, Kartarpur is going to go on. India and Pakistan are going to square off very soon at The Hague, because the Jadhav hearings are at a certain stage. So, to my mind, obviously there is no prospect of dialogue as we know it between the two countries until the elections are over here for sure. But Kartarpur is an occasion when the government could call it off. But I suspect that they will not do so. I hope that they don't do so, because as I said, it doesn't serve any purpose. It's not as if the Jaish is going to be disciplined by this, or the Pakistani military is going to crack down on the Jaish because you're calling off a Kartarpur dialogue.
And there is dialogue, which is routine dialogue, and then there's crisis management.
Right.
We are in a classic case starting from yesterday of crisis management with Pakistan. And to manage this crisis to the beneficial resolution of both countries without having to go to war or armed conflict of any nature, you need a dialogue track. You need a track by which to tell Pakistan that here is our bottom line, this is what you need to do. If you don't have that dialogue track, how do you manage a crisis?
Until a year ago, we used to have the national security advisors talking to each other. Yes. And during the previous government, we used to have the back channel negotiators. Now we neither have the back channel negotiation nor the NSA level talks.
But we better hope that somebody is talking behind the channels right now.
Siddharth, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Ajay.
Thank you, Happy.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.